Stephen was born in July 1937 in Budapest, Hungary, to a non-observant Jewish heritage. His World War II experiences were that from 1944 his family was in hiding. His father was deported to Belsen and Theresienstadt. His mother and siblings and he were hidden using false papers. He left Hungary for the UK following the 1956 uprising in Hungary and obtained British citizenship from the mid-1960s. He spent his professional career as an architect. Stephen has been a Labour Party member since 1997 and is in Holborn and St Pancras CLP. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Stephen, and I'll now pass over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I want to start with saying that I was only 7-year-old during the Holocaust. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. My sort of memories are not continuous, really. It's all like bits of photographic events and short videos. It's not a total continuous memory, but some of the vital moments are there. I want to first say that there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Hungary, but the predominant reaction of the Hungarian Jewish community has been to to try to assimilate rather than having any strong influence of Zionism in this period. This is the pre-Second World War. So it all started really after the failure of the brief-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic, which was in 1918 to 1919, and which was followed by a very repressive regime, which is described also as the white terror with pogroms, and it brought in extreme right-wing ruler in Admiral Horthy, who was of noble descent, and at one time served the Kaiser Franz Joseph as an admiral of the then Austro-Hungarian Navy. And under Horthy, which started as a very violent regime, it then sort of transformed into a merely strongly conservative series of governments. And Horthy, Admiral Horthy himself, as by then the regent of Hungary, took a somewhat background role, but he was still representing the ultimate power if he wanted to. Now, the direct impact of his right-wing regime was first affected my father, who, because of the very first racist legislations in Europe, the introduction of the numerus clausus, which limited the number of Jewish students that universities could accept in any year. My father, who wanted to study medicine, had to start his studies in Prague. He couldn't get into a Hungarian university to begin with. Later, he was allowed to continue in a provincial Hungarian university, but not in the main one in Budapest. This was in the 1920s, and the Hungarian government was very proud that they had preceded with even Mussolini with racist legislation, the first one of seriously anti-Semitic legislation in Europe. Nonetheless, a great number of Hungarian Jews were achieving professional status and formed an important part of the Hungarian culture, really, during the intervening years between the two wars. And it came as a great shock when Hungary, having thrown in its lot, that is official government Hungary, with Hitler and the attack on the Soviet Union, it brought in much stronger influence of the Nazi regime within Hungary. And in the early 40s, there started to be a series of anti-Semitic legislations passed, which started to affect family life and life generally in Hungary, the Jewish lives, that is. So it started with the 40s. This increased the pressure on Hungarian Jewry, and later on, by the time the war was beginning to look pretty bad from a Hungarian official point of view, and they were beginning to hesitate perhaps to throw in their lot with the Allies rather than continue with Hitler and follow the example of Romanian accession from the Second World War. Around that time, because Germany became aware of these sort of secret negotiations and emissaries that were sent from the Hungarian government towards the Allies, they actually invaded Hungary, and Horthy became a captive nominal ruler from there on. This was in 1944, March 19, that they actually moved into Hungary and Budapest. And I remember seeing the German soldiers around that time and afterwards on the streets. Very much more restrictive legislation was brought in soon afterwards. Jews weren't allowed to travel. There were curfews introduced. And then it was compulsory to wear the yellow stars. Now, I do remember the very intimidated, sad atmosphere within the family when they first had to actually make their own yellow stars and sew it on clothes so that we were compliant with this rule. Generally, what I remember is the increase of fear within the family, rather than experiencing any direct fear myself, because I was simply too young to understand what was coming and what were the dangers. One of the restrictive rules introduced in 44 was concentrating of Jewish families into marked houses. These were houses, apartment blocks marked with yellow stars. And non-Jewish families were moved out and Jewish families were crowded in and concentrated in these houses. It was like an archipelago of a ghetto, really. Quite clearly, there were danger signs. It was like a sort of preparation to deportation. That was the fear. I remember a particular occasion where rumors were circulating that there would be immediate arrests from these yellow star marked houses. And my mother went out and bravely took down the yellow star in our particular house. And she was confronted by one of the more fascist inclined neighbors to say that we can see what you are doing and don't worry, we shall still get you in the end. So there was a great deal of fear in the air about what was coming. I don't know how much my parents knew about what was going on in the concentration camps. Deportation started in the countryside in Hungary in 44, May, June. And the population in Budapest knew very little about it. It was very quick, and something like 400,000 Hungarian Jews from the countryside were deported straight to Auschwitz. There were enough sort of rumors and fears, though, in the air to try to seek some kind of refuge and solution. And this is when my father, through our family's Transylvanian connection, got to know about the Kastner project, which was to offer some kind of protection and solution to a limited number of Hungarian Jews, mainly of Transylvanian background, and those of professional or in other ways regarded as elite groups. My family, through my uncle, did have some connections to Transylvanian cultural and intellectual circles. And maybe it was through that, rather than paying any serious amounts of money, which was the alternative way of doing it. That's how my parents and my uncles had been offered to join this project. So the whole family then found itself through this in a detention camp in Budapest, which was in the Columbus Street, the famous Columbus Street camp, on the grounds of an institute for the Institute for the Deaf, who were, it was a large building with large grounds, and the inmates were moved out, and a campus improvised on the grounds of this building. There were barracks, and we had been using sort of bunk beds and very primitive circumstances, latrines in the, rather than bathrooms, etc. But the camp was guarded by SS soldiers, armed SS soldiers on the outside, but within the camp, because of its special nature, within the camp, the Hungarian police was present, uniformed police, in small numbers, but they were present. The idea was that a certain number of people from these camps were to be transported temporarily to a special camp in Bergen-Belsen, and from there to Switzerland. This was Kastner's deal with Eichmann and other Nazis. Apparently, Himmler himself knew about it. And apparently, the payoff was that Kastner, who was a representative of the Zionist organization in Budapest, originally in Transylvania, but from 1944 in Budapest, that he would keep quiet about the fate of the rest of the Jewish population, which was, of course, extermination. So it was a very dubious collaborationist deal by Kastner, for which he later was much criticized and tried in Israel, and by some protester assassinated. There were one large transport of about 600 people who were subject to this deal, and later it grew to 1,600, I believe. And they were taken to a special camp in Bergen-Belsen, as was the deal. And from there, one transport, fairly soon after arrival, was transferred to Switzerland. But another part remained in Belsen and then transported as late as early December. But my father and uncles were themselves transported from this Columbus camp in late December. And apparently the whole deal was arranged with the knowledge of Himmler, but behind the back of Hitler himself. And when he got to know about it, he stopped it. And it very nearly cost Himmler his position. So the transport that my father was involved in, at the very last transport to Belsen, was stuck there. And it didn't ever make it to Switzerland. However, the Germans kept to the arrangement to the extent that this was a camp within a camp, so to speak, and they had a degree of self-government. They could keep their own clothes, etc. My father, who was a doctor, worked as a doctor within that camp. And eventually, they were transported on to Theresienstadt. And I think all these privileged positions had ceased there. And my father nearly died in Theresienstadt in typhus, but just by this narrow margin, he survived and later returned to Hungary. But we had absolutely no news of him. In the meantime, you could leave this special camp in Columbus Street in Budapest. And we actually left, and I was taken up by some organization ran by the Hungarian Protestant churches to a Swiss protected home in the Buda hills of Budapest, where we were sort of fairly well looked after, but we were living in a very dangerous existence on false papers all the time, in effect in hiding. This was mainly organized by a Hungarian Reformed Church priest called Gabor Stelo, who collaborated with the Swiss mission, which was represented by Friedrich Brandt, and it was supported by the Swiss materially as well. It grew into a large archipelago of homes, all supplied by the Swiss, and everybody on false papers and very dangerous existence. Our particular home where I ended up was opposite a rather fascistic organization who were suspicious of this children's home. We were supposed to be Transylvanian refugees escaping from the advancing Russians, everybody on false papers and so on. But luckily, we weren't raided by the Hungarian fascist police. So we were there to begin with in quite reasonable conditions, but the Russians were approaching, and Budapest was eventually completely surrounded, and the siege started by the Russians, and it reached our area as well eventually. So we had to escape a number of times in the middle of, pretty much in the middle of fighting. So it was an extremely dangerous existence, but somehow by 2 or 3 different attempts at escape, we managed to survive just about.
Stephen, I wonder if you can tell us, bring your talk to a conclusion, maybe tell us the important things now that you want to tell us.
Well, I think I've pretty much come to the end, because we had managed to survive, although the family was divided into different places. I was with an aunt, and my mother was somewhere else, and my father was in Theresienstadt at that time. So eventually, everybody came back, and we sort of united.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I couldn't help but draw a comparison between what you said about being in hiding with false papers and the fascistic neighbour threatening to tell about you, comparing with that with what Suzanne said about the children being in plain sight and that they were supported by acts of kindness. There we see 2 very different aspects of human nature. Thank you very much for your story. I know from looking at the chat that people found it both chilling and really, really interesting. So thank you very much. We'll come back to you in the questions.